Good afternoon. You are very welcome to our webinar this afternoon, The History of Our City and Its Influence on Public Health. This webinar will showcase the work of the SPACE project led by Queen's University in Belfast and outline some of the initial conversations that are taking place which explore the role of the built environment and its influence on public health. Participants are encouraged today to add questions for panel speakers in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And the presentation from speakers will be recorded and uploaded onto Belfast Healthy Cities website and also Queen's University website. If you're using X or Twitter, you can include @Belfast Healthy and @SpaceQUB in your tweets. So you're very welcome today. My name is Anne McCusker. I'm from Belfast Healthy Cities. And today is really about showcasing the work of the SPACE project. You'll hear from a range of the researchers involved in the work, from a really collaborative and wide-ranging piece of research that is really widening the conversation that we're having around the role of the built environment and how it impacts public health. Showcasing the work of SPACE is really to explore the many elements of the project, but also to consider the role of epigenetics, the role of the pollutants in our soil, our industrial history, and the urban design of Belfast, and how that has come together to shape public health that we have today, the health of citizens in our city, but also to consider what we need to think about when we are planning our city for years to come. So it aligns very much with the community plan for Belfast, which looks at 2035, an increase in city centre living. And as our population ages, what are the key factors that are missing from the conversations that we are currently having, and how do we embed it in both our policy going forward, the design of our streets and our communities, and also to shape public health for the future. So you're very welcome today and to contribute to this webinar by adding comments or questions for the speakers as we go along, both in the question and answer box and also on social media. Our first speaker today is Professor Amy Jane McKnight. Well, welcome Professor McKnight to the webinar. And if you are able to get ready to share your slides, I'll share some brief information on the work that you've been doing. So you're within the Public Health Centre in the Centre for Public Health at Queen's, a professor in molecular epidemiology. A great start to the webinar. So your research has focused on molecular factors that influence human health and disease and promote healthy aging. And we look forward to your presentation today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can everybody see those slides okay?
Yes, they're great. Thank you.
Perfectly. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to join today's discussions. I hope you enjoy this little bit of a whirlwind tour around some of the biological factors associated with public health. So effectively, at the start of the 20th century, Belfast was a really prosperous city, primarily driven by linen and shipbuilding industries, and there was many people moved from rural areas to work in the city. So while some people lived in really luxurious homes, others were much more moderate, and we still had a significant proportion of the community living in poverty. Today, Belfast is a thriving city. We've got many advantages, but we still have some old problems, and we've some new problems. And what is the impact of those changes on our biology? Has the impact of women working in the linen industry and being exposed to those associated chemicals led to Northern Ireland having more than 12 times the diagnosis of Behçet's disease than the rest of the UK? Behçet's disease is primarily associated with the silk trade route that started in China and passed through India, Persia, Italy, and Egypt. In common with other industrialised cities, Belfast residents also have higher rates of inflammatory heart and lung conditions. So the driving force behind much of what we do really is prevention by design. We're effectively trying to address both local and global public health challenges so that people can live more healthy life years. We're strengthening health equity and reducing the burden on national health systems. We know that health and disease come from really complex integration of biological, socioeconomic, and environmental risk factors. And we know that we need really meaningful collaboration to make a real difference, whether that's at the individual level, in communities, with policymakers and practitioners to help drive real change in the population. Promoting and sustaining health, intercepting earlier in disease processes, and targeting common drivers and mechanisms that underlie multiple diseases has potential to achieve a real step change in prevention of disease and promoting healthy aging. Excuse me. What do we know? Well, we know our bodies are complex biological systems, and the image on this slide illustrates some of the things that affect each person's biology, whether that's the food that they eat, the exercise they take, their social interactions, diseases, medications, even their financial status. We know that biomarkers are associated with health, with disease, and with our environment. Some biomarkers, like the majority of a person's genetic profile, are fixed at conception, while others will change across the life course. We know that some biomarkers change in response to poor health and the environmental features. If I use mental health as an example, Northern Ireland's Mental Health Strategy 2021 to 2031 documents the increasing levels of mental ill health in our community. Northern Ireland has 25% higher overall prevalence of mental health problems than England. Now, we know that a person's mental health is influenced by their social, economic, and the physical environments in which they live. 1 in 5 persons across Northern Ireland report feeling lonely. Approximately 12% of our Northern Ireland population contribute 2.4 million hours of unpaid work per week, yet supporting caregivers is often neglected. How can we design our environment to maximise healthy aging, promote social engagement, and really enable an effective work-life balance for as many people as possible? So it's not just about living close to green and blue spaces and those things we typically think of as healthy enablers within the environment. We're also really keen to explore the biological differences by people who just live geographically close to healthy environmental features, like a local park, versus those who actually regularly use the parks or the beaches and those who are unable to physically access them. So a few tweaks to urban designs could really enable significant public health benefits. For example, there's many accessible leisure facilities that exist across Northern Ireland, but people who need to use them would say knowing about them is a real challenge. Raising awareness of accessible activities would be welcomed by many communities, as would considerations by community planning authorities during the design phases. Is there a point living near a forest park or a playground if there's a stile that a walking aid can't get past or a height restriction that means your wheelchair accessible van can't access it? Never mind thinking about accessing toilets where local authorities have different radar keys and other limited facilities. I wanted to take this opportunity to emphasise that for people who already have significant health concerns, we need more research towards innovative approaches for supportive urban designs that really enable them to live as well as possible for as long as possible. And that brings me on to the question of what do we not know? And the answer is a lot. So within the SPACE project, we're starting to understand how environmental factors get under the skin to influence our underlying biology and really our subsequent health outcomes. We need to know which environmental features have the most impact on health outcomes. It's also really important that we tease out which biomarkers affect how people will react to their environment, compared to which biomarkers will change as a direct result of being exposed to something toxic. Most genetic biomarkers are fixed at conception. There's a small proportion changes throughout life, but the majority are fixed. And essentially, children get half their DNA from each of their parents, and they often have many of the same characteristics as their parents. You may have heard DNA being described as a blueprint for life, and this DNA or genetic information is encoded in genes. Genes are associated with addiction to alcohol, to tobacco, socioeconomic status at a population level. If I use smoking as the example, smoking has an estimated heritability of up to 70%. It's a leading cause of morbidity and premature mortality worldwide. The particular study I have on the slide here leveraged really rich data in electronic medical records, combined with genetic information and environmental data to identify robust genetic changes associated with smoking. Smoking trajectories were genetically correlated with more than 200 different health outcomes. There was 99 markers associated with people starting smoking and 13 associated with people stopping smoking when they looked at more than 1 million people. And that really kickstarted the question and research into towards should public health interventions and behaviour change strategies be targeted to people who have particular genetic profiles who are most at risk of starting what would be considered unhealthy behaviours, or towards those who are more likely to respond to behavioural interventions. If we have two groups of people who smoke, one of whom carries a genetic predisposition towards addiction and the other does not, then arguably those with the addictive genes are more likely to respond to standard public health interventions, while those who do carry the addiction genes may require more targeted support. There are few diseases that respond or result from a change in a single gene. Instead, most diseases are really complex and come from an interaction between everybody's genes and their environment. And when I'm talking about environmental factors, I mean things like chemicals in our air, water pollution, mold, pesticides, diet choices, even the grooming products that people choose to use. And really subtle differences in one person's genes can cause them to respond differently to the same environmental exposure as another person. And that means some people may develop a disease after being exposed to something in their environment, while others may not. I've used the example here of asthma, and asthma is a really excellent example where the severity of asthma is under genetic control. People's responses to asthma therapies is determined by their underlying genetic profile. And people with asthma and certain genes are exposed to a major traffic pollution, then they display more intense asthma symptoms than people who have the same environmental exposure, but not the same underlying genetic changes. Identical twins carry exactly the same DNA. And if genetics were primarily influencing health outcomes, then identical twins who lived in the same environment and were reared in the same house, we would expect them to both have the same disease. Everyone on the call knows they don't. And that's down to a relatively new biological marker called epigenetics. And epigenetics is really emerging as a new biological marker that's significantly contributing to public health stories. We know that where people are born, where they live, and where they work has an impact on their health. But we're in the very early stages of understanding how this happens. There are very few data sets that can be used to robustly investigate these types of associations. So our space project uses new approaches to help us understand how environmental impacts really get under our skin to influence the onset and the progression of diseases, and we have a particular focus on cognitive health. Epigenetics changes in response to people's diet, people's lifestyle, and their environmental exposures. We know that increased exposure to noise, air, or soil pollution leads to epigenetic changes and health complications, while increased access to green and blue spaces can help protect residents' health. If you look at the seesaw, it's trying to illustrate that careful balance between exposures and health outcomes. Some environmental features will be risk factors for disease, while others will have protective effects. And we're really trying to tease out these complex interactions. One thing I would draw your attention to that is really important is that epigenetic changes might be reversible. That means that if we can prevent or minimize exposure, or implement interventions that mimic protective biological effects, we can have direct health changes. Creating healthier cities is not just about helping ourselves, but also subsequent generations. We know that epigenetic changes can be passed down to children and grandchildren, and this is known as transgenerational inheritance. So the Dutch hunger winter is an excellent example of changes in the environment of a parent affecting subsequent generations. There was a period of significant wartime famine at the end of World War II, where daily rations distributed by authorities contained an average energy equivalent of 667 calories. That's less than a third or a quarter of what many people would consume in a day. It was a short period, but it was a significant restriction. For mothers who were pregnant during this time, their children had an increased risk of disease that was associated with a persistent change in DNA methylation. And effectively, their biology and that of their unborn children adapted to their environment, where they were effectively starved. The children were more prone to obesity, to higher cholesterol, to cardiovascular disease, as they had adapted in the womb to hold on to calories and to preserve their fat reserves due to the famine. So not only are we changing things for the current generation, but also for those who come after us. Highlighted in red on this very busy slide are some of the biggest public health issues we face that are contributing to significant premature death. These are all health outcomes that have been associated with environmental exposures. The purple text highlights just some of the other health conditions that are significantly impacted by exposure to environmental stressors. In a recent systematic review, we've demonstrated that environmental features have the most impact on a person's epigenetics. And our research demonstrates that exposure to toxic elements, such as heavy metals, noise, and air pollution, change our underlying biology to increase the risk of disease. The majority of the studies published so far have been looking at cancer. But what is starting to emerge is that living in an urban versus a rural environment, the local neighbourhood's social environment, areas of socioeconomic deprivation, and features of our built environment are all having a major impact. Epigenetic clocks are a way in which we can use to help measure accelerated biological aging. And we're using them to understand what causes difference between a person's chronological age in years versus their biological age. Why do some 70-year-olds feel like they're 40 and have similar health profiles? Why are some people biologically older before their time? We're exploring the links between each person's biology, environmental exposures, and their overall health. Nicola is a very rich population-based resource for Northern Ireland that we're using to help enable these complex multi-omic analyses. Essentially, we're evaluating biological markers that are associated with individual environmental stressors and working out which have the most impact on health outcomes. The aim of that is to inform which environmental features are best incorporated into planning designs to maximise the health of our population. In an era of very limited financial resources, should we be devoting more money to building accessible children's playgrounds, to providing accessible greenways, or to supporting community groups that improve social connectivity? I mentioned that a subset of the population respond differently to environmental stressors than others. And we're really keen within the SPACE project to identify those individuals that are most likely to benefit from targeted interventions to promote healthy aging. People who demonstrate resilience to negative environmental impacts can help us learn more about how best to mediate toxic effects within our environments, either by practical design or by developing new therapies. So I appreciate that was very much a whirlwind tour, and thank you for your time, and I'm very happy to take any questions when ready.
Thank you, Professor McKnight. That was fascinating. I think it really opens up the conversation on you said, what we know and what we can include going forward. So we already know that where people are born, live, and work contribute to their health and their health outcomes. But this really changes that conversation around what we have been considering so far. There has been the features of the built environment and certainly environmental factors such as pollutions, but how do we now consider our genetic makeup and particularly epigenetics and how that will feature in the design of our built environment and should going forward. So I would encourage everyone that has a question or a comment to add it to the Q&A box, and we will discuss that at the end of the session after we've heard from the other presenters. So thank you very much. And we look forward to speaking to you further at the end of the webinar. Our next speaker is Professor Jennifer McKinley from Queen's University Belfast. You're very welcome. So Jennifer is a professor in geography and the director of the Centre for GIS and Geomatics at Queen's. And her research seeks to gain a greater understanding of the link between human health and environmental toxins. So what we are going to hear about now is that impact of the environment and our industrial past, and the work that the SPACE project has been doing to contribute to the ongoing conversation around our built environment and the link to public health. So thank you, Jenny, if you would like to share your slide.
Thank you very much, Anne. And hopefully,
yes,
everyone can see my slide, and I'll just...
Yeah, thank you.
So thank you very much, Anne, for the invitation, and also thank you, AJ, for setting that excellent context. So I want to look a little bit more about the impact of the environment on our health. And I'll start at the global scale. And this is obviously an issue that the World Health Organization is very aware of. In fact, in one of their latest reports, they mention that it's 23%, they estimate, of global deaths are linked to the environment. And that roughly amounts to 12.6 million deaths a year. So that is directly linked to the environment. But actually, as we interact with the environment, and through what AJ has just described, there's probably more interaction with the environment and the impact on our health than even this really significant figure actually suggests. And that's really what we're trying to look at in terms of our SPACE project. So looking at the varied routes that the environment may actually affect and that we interact with it, I'm going to look a little bit more in detail about soil pollution. But we're very aware that as we interact with our environment, the air is something, and pollutants in the air. But the pollutants that might include light and noise pollutants are actually probably less thought of and less well explored. But all of these are really important and have a potential to impact on our cognitive development and as we age. And I would encourage you to look at our fact sheets that this SPACE project has developed. So what we need to really explore these and the potential links between our biomarkers and the environment is an evidence base. So we know that there are urban pollutants. We know that what impacts, whether it's toxic materials in the air or in the soil, or from other types of chemicals. We know that there's potentially a link, or we're exposed to those. We know that there is an impact of chronic noise and light pollution. But how do we actually provide the evidence base to start to explore this and to link it with epigenetics or our biomarkers? Well, if I look at Belfast as a little bit of a case study, and Belfast is very typical of quite a few urban centres right across the UK, then we can see that the historical development of Belfast really sets a very particular scene for us in terms of what actually might be a legacy of pollution. And we can see this in our soils. So we're very aware that in Belfast, we have a history of development. And the little map in the middle shows a development of Belfast from 1858 right through. It was mapped again in 1901, which is the blue colour, right through to the brown colour, which is the expansion from 1919 to 1939. And obviously Belfast has developed through that. And one of our colleagues who now is based in Belfast City Council, Rebecca McElwain and colleagues, really found and explored the evidence of this legacy of both geogenic but anthropogenic contamination and how that was linked to the historical development of Belfast. So we know that we have a history of shipbuilding, and that in the work that's been done during that time provided and used materials such as copper and zinc and tin, lead and antimony. And now we can see the legacy of this in our soils. But we also have a modern opportunity for air pollution in terms of we're one of the few UK cities that actually has a city airport. So we know that there's a legacy of this anthropogenic, this urban contamination in our soils. So we can start to explore this through some sort of data analytics. And as we do that, the image on the right, which is like a dendrogram or a tree, branching tree type of approach, we can very clearly identify what we know are geogenic, or in other words, contaminants in the soils, which are much more linked to our geological underlay, so the bedrock that Belfast is based on. And those very clearly can be differentiated with the anthropogenic sources, so the more urban sources or the historical legacy in the soils. But actually, as we look again, and this is on the left, if we start to look at this in much more detail, then we really can define the origins, not only of the geogenic, some of the geogenic sources, such as our basalts, that we're very proud of in terms of the Giant's Causeway, but again, they are a source of particular elements. But also then of the anthropogenic sources, as I've mentioned, that are linked to the industrial legacy. So zinc and antimony and other sources that might be related to brass development or bronze production. So something that's related to our history, our shipbuilding. But actually more interesting is actually some of the toxins or the elemental elements that are coming out that might actually be linked to more modern anthropogenic pollutants. And this is interesting because if we can start to identify the sources and where we know they are based, then that helps us start to think about how the urban population, say of Belfast or any other city, will start to interact with those. What are the opportunities? What are the pathways, the sources, the pathways, the exposures that we might be susceptible to, and where are those? So urbanization has an increasing impact on our soils, and it's resulting in increased potentially these toxic elements. And then soils can be used as these urbanization tracers to determine whether it's a geogenic, a natural source, or an anthropogenic contamination source. So if we look at one chronic disease in particular, and again, AJ mentioned kidney and the known fact that it is linked potentially to the environment. So if we look at chronic kidney disease, and we can see that this is for Belfast, so the population of Belfast, and the data are provided by the UK Renal Registry, then we can see that as our population ages, we have an increasing risk and I suppose issue with chronic kidney disease. And in fact, chronic kidney disease is much higher for the Northern Ireland based on our average population than the rest of the UK. And there's one type in particular, which is, I suppose, something that maybe we don't naturally think about, but chronic kidney disease of unknown etiology. In other words, this is chronic kidney disease where the practitioners have ruled out every other factor. So they don't know the cause. So it is listed as unknown causes or unknown etiology. And for us, for Belfast, we have up to 12 times higher than would be expected for Northern Ireland's average incident rates. So this is something that needs to be explored. Can this be linked then with some of the factors that AJ was mentioning? So to do this, we need an integrated approach. We need to look at not just the soil, the air, the noise, pollutants, but also we know that where we live in terms of our economic, our employment, really all of those social deprivation measures is going to be important. So again, we have a rich database and rich data within Northern Ireland to bring that into the examination. And then we have health data, and then we have the environmental data. So we can integrate all of these types of data to try and explore this study of the exposure, how we are exposed to these different elements and how that might affect our health. So I'm not going to go into the detail of some of the types of analysis that we ran, but really I want to show some of the results. And particularly I am thinking about, first of all, chronic kidney disease. And this is for all of our age groups greater than 16. And what our findings showed was that there was a correlation, a significant correlation with the multiple deprivation indices in particular of employment and income. And that's really important to show that there is actually that relationship between our deprivation indices, how people live, their employment, their income, and that is very much related to where they live, and potentially their health, and in this case, chronic kidney disease. And these factors have also been used as an indication of the socio-economic factors such as smoking. Another piece of evidence or results that we found was that for the area of Belfast, and this is particularly the historical development of Belfast from 1919 to 1939, we actually find the strongest statistical relationship with the elements of copper and antimony. Now we know that these are linked to industrial areas and were used in the smelting or alloying purposes for silver and lead and tin. So this is a finding that shows that, again, the development of Belfast and the legacy of those toxins in the soils might actually be linked to the development of chronic kidney disease. And this is the sort of work that we then need to take further and look at the biogenetic markers. Are some people more susceptible than others? So if we think about the chronic kidney disease of unknown etiology, so this is the, I suppose, the people that are presenting before they go into any renal replacement therapy, and the doctors, the practitioners cannot link it to any genetic factors or any other factors. When we look at our results for this category, we see the strongest statistical correlation with the elements of arsenic and molybdenum. I know you may not be very familiar with molybdenum, but if we think about our transport networks, and again, the image on the right is showing the chronic kidney disease of unknown etiology for the super output areas in Belfast. And you can see that there is an inferred relationship with the main transport links within Belfast as well. Now, the interesting thing about this is that, you know, we may think, well, is there a geogenic? In other words, is it linked to the underlying geology? And we do have naturally occurring arsenic in our soils, in our rocks. But there's also an interesting finding that air pollution, traffic, and brake wear emissions have also been cited as sources for these heavy metals. We also know that arsenic and molybdenum are linked to the atmospheric pollution, including traffic pollution. And brake wear emissions in particular have been cited as sources for antimony and molybdenum. So could our findings, and could the chronic kidney disease for unknown etiology, which for Belfast is up to 12 times higher than we would be expecting for Northern Ireland, could it be linked to where people live in terms of the transport networks? Well, research, as AJ mentioned, research into air pollution and all forms of chronic disease are still quite unknown and under-researched, but it's particularly for kidney disease. But we do know that these very fine particles, including lead, molybdenum, and antimony, can get into our bloodstream. And if they get into the blood, then they can translocate to other tissues, including our kidneys, but also the liver, and in particularly for the space project, interestingly, the brain. So as well as our soils showing evidence of air pollution deposition, we might need to think about the air pollution data. So how can we bring in different types of air pollution data? But our soils at this stage, we can say, are a proxy for the availability of nephrotoxins, and that's particularly for chronic kidney disease. So molybdenum is an interesting element in that, yes, it can be formed naturally, but in terms of the world production of molybdenum, it has increased exponentially. And this is because it is used in brake pads. A recent study showed that molybdenum sulfide is one of the most commonly used solid lubricants in commercial brake pads. So this is an important anthropogenic source that we need to explore as part of our integrated approach. If we look a little bit more at air pollution and health, and particularly traffic pollution, then there has been, I'm sure you all remember this landmark study and landmark finding that unfortunately a 9-year-old child, Ella, was found that the air pollution had made a material contribution to her death because of where she lived. She lived on a very busy South Circular Road in London, and she died in 2013. This is one of the first studies to really link air pollution, in particular traffic pollution, and health. And if you look at the image on the right-hand side, this is for the very fine particles 2.5 for 2018, and also for the different types, nitric oxide, and that we can see from our air pollution data. It is very closely linked to Belfast, but also to the transport links. So how can we explore this a little bit further? So in work that we've done, we have used not just now the soil pollutants, but we've integrated that with air pollution covariates, and in particular, benzene, carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide, and then the particulate matter of PM10, and then the very fine particulate matter of PM2.5. So we integrated this through, again, our spatial data analysis. And the key findings that we found were that there was a very strong statistical correlation with the carbon monoxide and sulfur dioxide and PM2.5 in particular with the chronic kidney disease data. Now, we really need further research to fully examine this and the effects of atmospheric pollutants on not just chronic disease, but then how that might interact with cognitive health as well. There has been much talk about electric cars and brake pads, and when I have discussed this work and presented it, quite a few questions have been, well, if we bring in electric vehicles, will this not solve the problem? And it is true that electric vehicles don't use friction pads, brakes as much as our normal cars, and this is because of the regenerative braking, and so they create or should generate less dust. But then there's also been some discussion on, well, the heavier weight of the electric vehicles with their battery packs then offsets this. And the heavier weight, is that related to more tire-related particle emissions? So the jury is out in all of this, but I think all studies agree that more research needs to be done in real world conditions. But this whole issue has been taken very seriously, and it is now included certainly in the EU's emission rules. So it's not just the fine particles that we find maybe from tailgates of vehicles, but also now from brake pad emissions as well, and brake pad wear. But in some of our recent workshops in space, I think a very important point was raised. And actually, the discussion on electric vehicles and are they better than normal vehicles, actually, maybe it's a distraction from the real issue of, do we have an overdependence on car use, especially in urban areas within Northern Ireland? And we don't want the discussion of which cars might be better. Yes, they might improve, but is that really going to improve overall our interaction with the environment? So it's a very important point, but needs to be discussed much further. So then next steps, what do we want to do? Just like AJ, we know that we're coming from different angles, but we know that we need to integrate these different types of data together. And that's what we've been doing in the space project in generating our space geoportal, integrating the different types of environmental data to make that available to policymakers, to industry, to research, to other communities, so that we can then link that to our health data. Because I might show and have presented some statistical correlations, but are they actual causal? And what is the relationship with our genetic biomarkers and our epigenetics, so that we can actually find out, is it exposure, and how do different people then react to that exposure? And then how do we actually try and work so that the environment can, as AJ says, reverse that process? I think that Ruth will emphasize some of our upcoming events, but I do just want to mention the launch of this geoportal on the 26th of October. So I would just like to thank again our sponsors and our space team, and would welcome any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. Again, a very interesting and thought-provoking presentation, certainly linking to our industrial past, and as we are considering even the food provision for the city and the growing agenda. Where do we grow our own food? How is that impacted by pollutants in the soil? But that clear link then to chronic kidney disease, and if it's not genetically linked, then what are the causes? So very interesting. And I suppose then posing the questions as we move towards electric cars and are encouraged to do so, is that good enough, or do we need to consider how we travel for short distances, and what is the best option available? So I would encourage you to add questions and comments to the Q&A box, and we pick that up at the end of the webinar. So thank you very much, Jenny. We move on to our third speaker, Professor Brendan Murda. So Brendan, if you would like to just turn your camera on and then get ready to share your slides, you're very welcome. So Brendan is Professor of Urban Planning at Queen's University. He is a town planner who has researched and written widely on socio-economics, community development, and urban regeneration. And we look forward to your presentation today. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne, and hello everyone. I really want to look at the sort of the historiography of planning in the city, and to point out the link with public health over time and place, and planning as a discipline and as a policy intervention has its roots in public health. When we think about the early legislation and planning, is very much around sanitation, water supply, overcrowding, and housing. And as the speakers have said, we're moving back in that direction when we think about the big urban challenges around aging, obesity, walkability, and poverty. But I wanted to start where Jenny left off, which was about roads. This is from 1945, and it's a plan for the centre of Belfast, very much based on the overlay of a major road infrastructure on the city just at the end of the Second World War. And to some extent, that ideology around roads and our belief in the car at a time whenever the car was rapidly expanding is still inflected not just but our thinking about the built environment and how it should be planned, and I'll be coming on to that in a moment. But I wanted to look at transport, roads, and first housing, and to maybe trace some of the development of planning and the built environment through the lens of housing. Belfast, as Jenny said, developed rapidly at the tail end of the 19th century, largely in response to industrialization, then in shipbuilding, heavy engineering, tobacco, whiskey, all the story that we know. The population changed from 1841, there was around 70,000 people in the city. And 30 years later, there was 170,000, all crammed in pretty much a typical industrial urban shift that we had seen from the countryside to the city in the Industrial Revolution. And with it came large-scale poverty, cholera, and really poor housing conditions. A sanitary commission was established in 1848, and Andrew Malcolm first reported in 1852 the conditions, particularly of working class areas in the city, very much to draw attention to the way in which urbanisation, industrialisation, poverty, housing and disease all concentrated, and mapped it and put it into statistics. And I think the urban representation of knowledge, whether it's in the form of maps or statistics, or as we'll see later, photography and oral narratives, are absolutely important at shifting the agenda locally towards a much more pro-public health agenda. He was especially interested in cholera and found in Cromit Ward large cesspools and open drains. Only 3,000 of the 10,000 houses had piped water. 180 thoroughfares were unpaved. 7% of the housing had deficient sewage. And he was especially interested, he's done here, at mapping not just the city, but the housing itself, because he was especially concerned about the way in which overcrowding and dense housing, courtyard and back-to-back housing that accompanied the industrial period was very much a concentration of those sorts of diseases. He showed in this sort of mapping that 3,000 houses had no yard, no outdoor space, and very cramped conditions. A royal commission in 1859 showed, whilst Belfast may not have been necessarily any worse than anywhere else, still nevertheless was a concentration of disease, and especially linked to poverty. Many of these reviews, including Malcolm, blamed the poor and blamed whiskey drinking as a contributory factor. Belfast was a major whiskey producer at that time. But also what Malcolm drew attention to was low wages and poverty. And this very dense network of urban concentrated streets, this is West Belfast and the Shankill area, give life to these sorts of courtyard forms of housing that simply were concentrations and enabled the easy transmission of disease, especially around these types of courts. Just as his maps, Malcolm's maps were important, so was Hogg's photography. And in a sense, these representations were early forms of a house condition survey, often paid for by the council to draw attention to the issues that were there. Jacob Rees had famously photographed Manhattan and the in particular the tenement squalor that had been seen in New York with the Industrial Revolution, on how the other half lived in 1890. And this was somewhat similar. It was drawing attention to the urban condition and drawing attention to the way in which the housing conditions had created problems of low infant mortality, high transmission of disease, and very high death rates, especially among the poor. A third dimension of this was oral reports, and as Engels was writing about the condition of the working class in Manchester, the Reverend William O'Hanlon, a Presbyterian minister, was doing the same towards Belfast, largely as a treatise to draw attention to the politics of the poor. And he was very interesting because he drew attention to the way in which the sectarianism of the city almost had divided not just the religions, but attention away from poverty, and how, in particular, concentrated around the court housing at the time. Combined with Hanlon's statistics, he showed that cholera deaths were nearly twice that in the rest of the UK. And this narrative around statistics and mapping and oral narratives and photography were absolutely critical at shifting the dial towards a much more pro-public health agenda in our planning and housing. Now, one of the reasons why problems were allowed to accumulate here was because although we had this sort of mass attention and lobbying around public health and housing in particular, very few of the legislative provisions across in England in particular were transferred to then Ireland. So public health acts that introduced a rudimentary public health system in 1848 were not brought over. But other legislative provisions to provide housing for the poor, to make landlords responsible for private rented conditions, to clear slums, and to bring in new water infrastructure simply did not come across. And that lived on right up until the Second World War. It wasn't that these pieces of legislation in themselves were particularly reformist or did a huge amount to recast British cities, but it shifted the dial towards a much more interventionist approach by the state. Related to that, we did not have the same investment in ideas and ideology. The response to the industrial city and to urbanisation in particular was quite widespread and transmitted through ideas like the Garden City movement by Ebenezer Howard. And this was really asking us to rethink the whole nature of our cities. It wasn't just about factories and profit and the individual, but it was about how we lived. Howard's idea was for a decentralised range of small-scale cities that would have the best of the country and the best of the city, but would have a strong people orientation towards it. Very low density, a lot of open spaces, people providing and consuming their own produce, healthy produce, the segregation which we take for granted today between noxious industries and where people lived. Many of those ideas, again, did not fall within the local consciousness, and certainly not within the political or even the nascent policy community that was emerging at that period. We did have experimental responses, and some of the innovative examples here around philanthropic and industrialists are worth looking at. Grub Richardson's Foreign Betsbrook, having seen the slum conditions around his original plant in Lisburn, this became one of the largest damask producers in the world. But for the first time, in many respects, we had seen these sorts of experimental initiatives with good standards of housing, very good room, air, light standards, outside toilet, but plenty of open space and plenty of amenities for local people to use. It had its own dispensary with a doctor and a nurse, its own hydraulically powered transport system, which itself was innovative at the time. You can go and visit it in the Ulster Transport Museum now in terms of the tram that was there. Its own water supply and its own electricity. The Quaker diarist, and Grub Richardson was a Quaker, and many of the people who got involved and engaged in these alternative forms of planning were themselves Quakers like the Cadburys at Bourneville. In fact, Grub Richardson and Bessbrook had a big influence on the Cadburys. The diarist Caroline Fox came to Bessbrook in 1852 and found a flourishing village, a most happy, prosperous place with its immense factory, beautiful schools and model houses for workmen. And that was very much the orthodoxy of the time. But George Bernard Shaw came at the same time and found a place where he found people never swear or get drunk, would like to do both, and the swan in the mill pond would like to drown itself, and really drew attention to something that quite fundamental in terms of our understanding about housing, planning and public health, that it was very much from the planner's perspective or from the philanthropist's perspective about how people lived, about how we set the rules, who knows best for the environment, and how we should live was all done onto the people who lived there and how they were rehoused. And again, we see some of that transmitted in the way in which planning and housing legislation changed throughout the 19th century. Very low building record in the interwar period compared to across the water, where homes for heroes were causing the mass municipalisation of housing. The Carnforth report drew attention to indescribable filth and squalor in the city right during the Second World War. And Belfast City Council built very few houses in that period, hadn't the money or the technical proficiency, hadn't the planners or the scale, and didn't enact any of the legislation that we saw with early slum clearance, particularly in the UK. Much of the pressure came from the medical profession and came from the Socialist Medical Association to push against, not from planning or housing, but to push against making the city fit for the health of people, particularly given the very high incidence of ill health that we had seen in working class areas. By the 1960s, we estimated that we needed something like 2,000 houses a year. The council was only building 470. So when we came to 1974, we had the most unfit housing in Western Europe. The rate of unfitness in England at this stage was 7.3% compared to 24% in Belfast and 19.5% for Northern Ireland as a whole. The answer was radical modernism in the 1960s. And again, much of the shift tended to place the emphasis on the producers. As George Bernard Shaw pointed out, it was done for the convenience of planning, against planning ideals, and by the state, often onto and in spite of the people who had to experience the consequences of these decisions. Some massive redevelopment in the city centre, the relocation of people to new towns like Craigavon, Ballymena, Antrim, Carrick, Newtownards and Bangor, and a complete redesign of the city. So instead of the traditional arterial routes like the Falls and the Shankill and the Ormer Road, we moved to 12 district centres, all supplied for by cars. And you can see the type of infrastructure here on the bottom right-hand side in Sandy Row, the consequences of which Sandy Row are still living with. This caused massive displacement and a shift in our whole vernacular away from traditional low-density housing towards deck and high-rise, streets in the sky instead of streets on the ground. We also saw the outbreak of violence, and it was the motorway network and the slum clearance and the troubles themselves that caused these really wicked problems on the city. This was to be the motorway network for Belfast. Thankfully, a huge amount of it was not built, but does show the dominance of our car thinking in the way in which we plan the city. This would have been the M4 coming down Annandale Embankment onto the Lower Ormo, so the Lower Ormo Road here on the left and the river on the right, and shows the extent to which the car and car ownership and car and the economy went hand in hand at this stage. Allied to that was the massive slum clearance that we saw in the city, and undoubtedly much of that was needed. John Tyne, when he came here in the 1970s, wrote famously about motorways versus democracy, and drew on a range of British cities that was infected by this turn towards the car and belief in motorised transport against the human scale of the urban condition. Here in Belfast, he said, here the people could not defend themselves, especially in inner city Belfast and in particular in the west of the city, against the way in which this road-based transport was imposed on them. And my colleague Augustina Matahari has looked at the way in which this has now impacted our city and in terms of its urban legibility and form. This is the Lower Shankill, where she shows between 1969 and 2016 just how much of the urban fabric is now devoted to the car, how much space is devoted to the car, and how much of the fine-grained, highly pedestrianised, well-connected neighbourhoods that we had seen in the 1960s have been ripped up in favour of the motorised transport and the effects that we now see that Jenny described in her presentation. The big problem for us is lock-in, that once you built this road infrastructure, it has to be maintained. And in 2019, the Northern Ireland Audit Office said, we need basically 143 million just to keep the roads in a what's called a steady and sustainable state. So once you build them, they need to be maintained. We were spending around, in the previous 5 years, around 92 million a year. So we weren't even spending the amount of road money that we needed just to keep the road network where it was, and that was causing all sorts of problems. Yet the cycling infrastructure, the walking infrastructure, and the ambitious plan here, the cycling network delivery plan, which was set out some time ago leading up to 2031, was a really ambitious attempt to turn our attention away from from road-based transport to public transport and to walking and to alternative modes of travel. We've built very little of it. In fact, the current estimates for the York Street Junction show that it would cost around 160 million, upwards of 160 million to invest in that junction, which goes back to that 1969 plan. And it would take something like 100 million to invest in the rollout over 10 years of this walking and cycling infrastructure for the city as a whole. As we've seen from the previous presentations, these are about political choices around the modes of transport that we have, the diseconomies and where they land, particularly in terms of pollution and congestion, and how we really create a city that is going to challenge the big urban downstream challenges that we face around walkability, obesity, and community health. And then finally, housing. And we had seen housing and planning run together in this period, and in particular locked into this idea about redevelopment. Here on the left, we have the Lower Falls, Divis, and we know what happened in terms of the impacts of that on the local community. These houses have now been knocked down, and a more familiar scale and inclusive approach to regeneration has happened in the Lower Falls area. And this is what the market area would have looked like. This is Lower Cromick Street. And again, a really strong community protest to resist this form of modernising planning, obliterating much of the city centre at the expense of local people. One of the most powerful books written on this period is The Rape and Plunder of the Shankill by Ron Weiner. This, again, from the Hogg collection, shows what the Shankill was like at that period. And frankly, a valid criticism of Rayner's work is that there is a lot of nostalgic working class romanticism around some of what was there and what needed to be done. This housing stock was simply unfit. The houses could not be lived in. There was endemic poverty, and we saw over time that really this needed to be renewed. How it was done and the consequences of it being done was somewhat dramatic, and this is what Weiner paid attention to. He mapped all the relationships in the middle of the Shankill about who the familial and kinship networks that were absolutely vital to the way in which people lived their daily lives, how they cared for each other, how they looked after each other, how effectively a process of home help was assembled around the intimate street network that accompanied the type of things that Hogg photographed. His concern was much of that was ripped up by modernism and by the type of houses that we developed. And we saw new health problems appear on the agenda. People were lifted from these intimate street patterns into these streets in the sky, alienated, atomized, and moved away from the sense of community that they once provided, that sort of self-collective social care and kinship bonds on which any community would survive. We learned from some of this, and I think one of the interesting things about the 1980s and 1990s and the rise of the housing executive and the redevelopment programme is much more emphasis on participation and keeping people in the communities in which they were redeveloped from. Using rehabilitation rather than demolishing everything, housing action areas and trying to hold on to communities, a focus on traditional housing as opposed to deck and high rise, and a much more concern about the social fabric of our neighbourhoods. So in the early 1980s, we saw a new housing plan that placed much more emphasis on community participation and on smaller redevelopment areas. You can see the scale of it in the city as a whole. It did signal something of a social turn in planning policy with the Belfast areas of need, and for the first time, we started to measure area-based health profiles, the first recognisable one being in Moyard, where we started to uncover and reveal these other forms of ill health around the alienation, the loneliness, the isolation, new forms of poverty, new forms of welfarism that emerged at this time. Yet Belfast in the 1980s was considered, along with Naples, to be one of the worst cities in terms of housing conditions and urban conditions more broadly in Europe. And you can see the effects, the accumulated impacts of these things, particularly on our housing conditions. We did move from a baseline of being one of the worst housed communities anywhere in Europe in the 1970s to now one of the best. And I think there is sometimes an urgency to go and look at best practice from other places and models that have worked elsewhere. Actually, we don't have to look too far from our own backyard to see housing as a major success, where the state intervened with, yes, ambitious planning, a lot of investment, new regulatory mechanisms, particularly land purchase and compulsory purchase, to really change not just the housing stock and the urban fabric, but the way in which poverty, ill health, and social justice were read through housing. People got decent housing in decent communities, often for the first time. And it is a major uncelebrated success story in the way in which we think about our intervention in major urban problems, and in particular around things like ill health. So we went from 19.6%, and although the way in which housing conditions changed over time, right down to 2%. But regrettably, one of the things that we're now starting to see is the re-emergence of housing and health problems. The waiting list is going up. Homelessness is now in a sustained upward trajectory with lack of accommodation and new forms of homelessness. And whilst housing unfitness has gone down, it has tended to be concentrated in the poorest areas and in the most marginal sectors, especially private renting. Fuel poverty and our reliance and our normalizing of poverty in things like food banks and community supermarkets is reflected in the concentration and the sharp difference between the rich and the poor, which is increasingly stratifying not just our cities, but also our tenures. Just by way of conclusions, I think two big things. One is that we have an inherited lock-in and investment dependency on roads, and that is going to be very hard to shift. And it is going to take courageous political leadership, and we do know the issues about politics locally, to really replace our priorities and to reprioritize our modal transport to deal with the sorts of problems that we have seen because of our dependency on the car. But I would leave with this point about our successes in the way in which we have done this in the past. This is from Carrickhill in North Belfast. This is what it was like in 1880. We tried the modernist thing in the 1960s and built unity flats. They were now demolished. And we had a strong, long process of participation around the rebuilding of a much more human scale and intimate geography to the way in which the community itself designed its housing. It's a far more healthy area. It's a far more inclusive area. It's more prosperous, and people are happier living there. And I think that is an important implication for us, that many of these solutions have, particularly around the nexus on planning, housing and health, have been tried and tested here and have been shown to work. The unfortunate thing is the headwinds around us in terms of how we think about the city, dealing with aging, dealing with obesity, dealing with the sorts of pollutants that we have seen, not just in terms of climate change, but as a result of our dependence on the car, are things that we really do need to grasp urgently in the future. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Brendan. Again, another fascinating presentation to consider all of the factors that shape our health today. And I think particularly the space project and this webinar today and exploring the history of our city have highlighted three key contributions to health in Belfast, and something that cities across Europe will be considering today as well. So it's looking at the genetic makeup of our people, our citizens, and legacy was mentioned a number of times in a number of contexts. And I think the legacy of our city and our region can't go unmentioned, and how this is contributing to population health and public health today. So this the space project was set to look at the aging population and the impact on brain health, and that link between space, our green and blue spaces, and how the conversation is changing around what else we need to consider within urban planning today. We also looked at our industrial past, the issue of soil pollutants and things that we're not necessarily aware of day to day. Air pollution is very much on the agenda. We have heard about the contribution of the cars that we use to the health today, but also then noise pollution and light pollution, things to consider, and how we need to consider alternative travel options to how we currently travel for the health of our future populations. And then again, in urban planning, certainly the design of our city, very much from the 1800s, we were aware of lack of green and blue space and how that contributed to sanitation, but what are the issues that we're facing today? So 2030 is an agenda certainly the WHO are working towards in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, the Decade of Aging, and the Community Plan for Belfast is a 2035 agenda. So when we're looking at opportunities and challenges and the benefits of doing things differently, what can we learn from what we have heard today, and how can we, I suppose, influence policy and practice and ensure that we're not continuing to make the same mistakes. That sometimes we say we don't know what we don't know, but now we do know. We know the importance of genetics and epigenetics. We know about our industrial past and urban planning successes and challenges. So I would invite all speakers to turn on their cameras and their mic and come forward for some discussions. Brendan, I might start with you. From your presentation and your learning, you've highlighted housing as a key success for Belfast in terms of contributing to health. We are very aware of the homelessness issue, it's very visible. But what can we learn for city centre living? There is an ambitious target to increase city centre living. What do we need to consider in terms of the types of housing that are provided, and who it's provided for, the ageing population and families moving into the city, to create that social fabric? Or what are some of the challenges that we might face considering traveling around the city centre as well.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. I mean, this densification of the city is absolutely critical, and the targets are really ambitious, especially around the city centre, and that's something that we want to see. Any viable city has a 24-hour use, but it also has a balanced demographic. And unfortunately, what we're seeing in Belfast, and we're not alone, the OECD mapped 179 cities, and all were doing the same thing. Not quite, but nearly emptying city centres of older people. And if we look and map at Belfast over time, more and more older people are now living in suburbs, in coastal towns, and in smaller district commuter settlements, where services, assets, and connectivity just aren't as good. What we're starting to see in the city centre is what's called youthification and studentification. It is the young professional class, and it is the students, and you look at the amount of investment that's gone into the city and purpose-built student accommodation, including by both universities, and with Ulster moving their campus to the city centre, that has accelerated that. It's Titanic Quarter, it's service sector, high value jobs, great to see, but it is young professionals and apartments that are going into that area. You don't see much in the way of a balanced provision or very strict enforcement of conditions around the type of housing, whether it's social housing, whether it's affordable housing, or whether it's housing for older people and a mixed demographic, being really enforced on some of those sites that are emerging. And I do think that if we want to get the balance back into our demography and have a city centre that reflects the different people who live here and not just one particular demographic group or social class, then we really need to enforce that type of local planning regime and new schemes. It's great to see the city repopulating in some of these old industrial areas coming back to life, and the students coming in, and Ulster bringing its campus in is great. But if it's going to be old versus young, rich versus poor, in a city that's already pretty segregated, these new forms of segregation also need to be challenged.
Yes, thank you. And please feel free to contribute to any of the questions that are being asked. I'll go through the questions that participants have added, and there'll be an opportunity to follow up with presenters if you don't get your question answered today. In terms of your presentation, AJ, we talked about physical access. So we're very aware of providing spaces that are physically accessible and acceptable to people. They're good quality, that can be used. But I think it particularly fascinating was really the genetic profiles, the predisposition to conditions, and how the chemicals in the products that we use and also in our air can contribute to our individual and our population health. So in terms of the priorities going forward, you posed a few questions. Where do we invest our money? Where is best value for money? How do we create greater resilience in terms of the design of the built environment? Or is it investing in new therapies? Can you just expand further on the priorities that including the conversation around epigenetics, to prioritize the work or the investment that we use going forward, how that can contribute to the conversation?
Yeah, so I guess my first caveat is that the research is still ongoing and there are no easy answers. Yeah. Nicola is fairly unique in that it is one of the first cohorts that has gathered this broad range of diverse data from different providers effectively. And we're primarily looking in our older age group. We have other studies that look at younger children and look at the impact of the environment on people at those younger age groups. And what we're really finding is that it's those early life exposures that have the most impact across the life course. So the data at the minute shows that investing in things that help people in early childhood, whether that's maximizing their healthy environment or creating more play areas, for example, has a more long-lasting impact on later life health outcomes. But Nicola is just the start. We need many more studies that track people from birth right across the life course, and they just don't exist at the moment.
Great. So I think that was one of the questions. How are young people affected? Are they affected more substantially? But while we recognise that space was looking at the ageing population and including very much the voice of older people as stakeholders in developing the research agenda, it is interesting then to see for Belfast, which has a relatively young population, how can this then shape future health? So thank you. Yeah, but a tough question to answer always. We see in terms of questions there, the impact on younger people. And then we have a question for Jenny. In terms of the industrial development of Belfast, I know we spoke specifically about chronic kidney disease and how this can either be increased or reduced, but we saw significantly when we compare Belfast to other cities that there was a significant incidence of it. And when we talked about alternatives that are being put forward and how we travel, we're moving towards electric car. That doesn't always solve the problem. What are the benefits of considering heavy metal exposure and in terms of active travel planning or city planning for future, now that we know contribution certainly to chronic kidney disease and other key instances of cancer and lung conditions? How could we use this information in the planning of our city going forward?
Yeah, no, thank you, Anne. It's really important. I mean, I think that in terms of transport and car use, people are more and more thinking about obviously air pollution, traffic pollution. Even changing from the emphasis on air pollution to also traffic pollution is a major step. But actually our soils can give, so they're basically the markers, they're urbanization markers for these toxins and for these particulate deposition. So sometimes it's hard to get the evidence from the sort of air pollution data, or particularly what is relevant, particularly for traffic pollution. But if we combine that information with actually what's in our soils, because this is the closest to where people live, air pollution is dispersed, and it's difficult to maybe attribute. I mean, yes, we can do it, and we're doing it within space to the sort of proximity or buffers around roads, if you like, but it will still be diffuse, it'll be dispersed. But the soils are an extra marker by what the contaminants and these in particular, I suppose, these fine particulate matter, and also the elements or metals that actually might come from the traffic pollution, not just from brake pads, but I think the brake pads are an emerging, generally it has been from the tailgate, it has been from what comes out of the, the back of the car or whatever. But now we're realizing that there's metals used, copper's used in brake pads. And particularly this increase in the world's dependence on and manufacture and development of more molybdenum, we're realizing actually we can see that in our soils, and therefore we can link it to the road networks. And that's really important because it is linked to where people live, and that's linked to what Brendan said. I do see one of the questions is about the impact on the socio-economic groups. And unfortunately, again, this is linked to what Brendan has said. We still have areas of housing we have in the past, and we still have areas of housing that are very close to these major road networks. And therefore, where we live, or where linking it to AJ's work, where we've actually grown up, will have an impact. So we need to take that into account, which is why Nicola is so important, because we can track people from where they've potentially lived and moved, to, and the impact those environmental factors might have had in that progression. But that also hopefully opens up an opportunity to, if you move to an area that has much more greener infrastructure, then can we reverse those those issues that may have been embedded at an earlier stage. So I suppose in answer to one of the questions that has been posed, yes, unfortunately, we can see that relationship in the results and the work that we've done with those socioeconomic factors, particularly the measures of income, employment, and health are coming out for chronic kidney disease. But we know that chronic kidney disease is linked to aging as well. So it does matter where you live. Your socioeconomic background is all part and parcel of this story, unfortunately.
Yeah, thank you. And I think you highlighted something that really important that AJ also mentioned. It's that sense of hope that it can be reversed, and it's the importance of thinking about the protective factors and how we put those in place, and the structure of the environment in which we live and which we grow is really important for creating that socially, but also for epigenetics as well. So a question to all panel members, how can we reconcile the need for more compact cities that reduce car dependency with the need for less cramped living conditions that characterised much of the 19th century and proved detrimental to health? So it's that use of space, the availability of space, and how we create the conditions that, knowing what we know going forward, what are some considerations?
I think from a planning point of view, it's a huge issue, and it's kind of bubbled up with COVID, that we want this high density living, that enables the sorts of things that we've seen in the past. High density living enables all sorts of transmission of various diseases, and that's something that people are rethinking in terms of planning logic. But there's lots, and some of the questions have pointed to this. There's lots of good examples where very high density living does not necessarily mean bad design or even bad space standards. Some of our problem in the past is high density living has meant small units, small rooms, low window access to air, and cramped outdoor spaces. Whereas we've seen excellent models here of where we can achieve very high density living and still build a high quality public realm, still have very good accommodation, good public assets, but that has to be priced increasingly in the schemes. I think far too often the logic of profit and the scheme developers seem to take hold over the collective gain or the rules around which those schemes are implemented in terms of their density space standards. And we do have in planning very good and very strict standards around space, height, number of units. We need to get better at really pushing them home and enacting them, but they're not incompatible things to have high density living in good quality environments.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Jenny or AJ, if you would like to comment, or if you're happy to.
Well, I guess my comment, and it's not really my expertise in this particular area, but I guess my comment is the need to bring in all members of the community so that we're minimizing inequalities of access and resources. I think the challenge is in public engagement and how to get those who need to be involved actually involved in the conversation, rather than just complaining about things after the fact. But it's a struggle we all have. But I think this is one area where we really do need that broad outreach and engagement.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And maybe just a few comments. I mean, I think this is where it's an integrated sort of approach. I mean, I completely agree with AJ, bringing people into the conversation to understand why maybe some sort of schemes have been developed, getting their input into what are the best schemes that actually works best for the community as well as planning and our health. There are ways to combat air pollution and traffic pollution, which are sort of, we call them nature-based solutions. So again, that brings in much more greening environment, whether it's trees or hedges or something that is good for our mental health, but also is actually very good for protecting us against some of these toxins. But it's also about monitoring. It's also about understanding and providing the evidence to show that, yes, this is having an impact. So I think it's a multi sort of agency integrated developed approach and raising awareness.
Very much. And I think that's a really good point. The space project is very much about starting that conversation. I think we have introduced collectively a broad range of researchers working together that I haven't seen before, and I think it's really fascinating the presentations today and how that can contribute to the work that's taken place and influencing policy and shaping how our city looks. So thank you very much for your presentations today. I think most of the questions have been answered, but we can certainly pick up on any that haven't been. And I think the presentations have really sparked interest. And it's about how we continue to consider the findings of space and what next and what's available. So I welcome Professor Ruth Hunter to talk about the availability of evidence and how we can use it and what's next in terms of events within the space project and where we can go for more information, because it's really just whet our appetite and now we want to know more. So thank you, Ruth.
Brilliant. Thanks, Anne. And I'll not keep you so long because I appreciate it's time's nearly up. I just want to say thanks to Brendan, Jenny, and AJ for 3 brilliant talks. I've heard them speak many times before, but I always learn something new. So thank you. I thought they were fantastic. And thanks, Anne, for your excellent chairing, particularly of the discussion. I just wanted to highlight a few events we have coming up for the space project. So Jenny had mentioned the geoportal. We've been working with our partners from Land and Property Service for the last year, essentially to bring together over 80 different environmental data sets into one place where you can access the data, download it, do analysis, etc. So we'll share these slides afterwards, but it's happening on the 26th, Thursday, 26th of October at 3:30 in the Canada Room at Queen's. And there's a link there to register for that event. Anne also mentioned our video series that we launched in June with one of our space webinars. So the links there to those various different videos. And we also have the different fact sheets, etc. Available as well, and all the different types of environmental exposures, some of which were talked about today. You can download those from the space website. Please feel free to use them in your research, in your teaching, and circulate as you find useful. And many of you would have been involved in our workshops that we've been doing essentially for 3 Wednesdays in September, which has brought together people from research, policy, practice, and the community, really to set about talking about a policy agenda for the role of environment and health, and particularly looking at the important role it plays in prevention that we've heard a lot about today. So we've just finished those workshops last Wednesday, so we're in the process of writing up a report and some potential different outputs, both around policy and practice for that. So we hope to have more to share over the next few weeks in regards to the different outputs. And just to mention then, we have another webinar coming up on the 28th of November. This is going to talk specifically around some novel environmental exposures. And we have Professor Frank Kelly from Imperial College London confirmed to speak at that around the role of ambient microplastics and health. And we'll have some other speakers from Queen's and from the WHO to join them as well. So we'll share these slides just in terms of different upcoming events, and it'd be great to see you there. So Anne, I'll come back to you.
Thank you, Ruth. So look forward to the events that are coming up, and also the information and evidence that's available through space to continue working on the areas that have been identified. So thank you to our speakers, Professor Emmy Jane McKnight, Professor Jennifer McKinley, and Professor Brenton Murda, and of course, Professor Ruth Hunter. It's been fascinating hearing more about the SPACE project. A recording of this webinar will be shared with all participants after the event, and you will also receive a link to the launch of the GeoPortal and the upcoming webinar on the 28th of November, and a link to the fact sheets and videos that Ruth mentioned on the SPACE project. And for any other information, please get in touch, and we look forward to joining you at a future event. Thank you.